Hey everybody, how are you doing? I'm Brian Rice and I'm a photographer who's based in the Kansas City area. And this is another one of my photo editing series where I take you through and I show you how I edit a photo. But before we get started, if you can do me a huge favor and like and subscribe, that would really help me out as I continue to make these videos and grow this channel. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so the previous photo that I did a video on was of Kylie from a senior photo session that I shot last October. This video is going to focus on a photo I shot of her older sister Cassidy from October of 2017 when I shot Cassidy's senior photos. So basically, whereas I chose Kylie's photo because it was a high contrast photo with some dappling from the sun hitting her and part of her's in shade, which kind of is one of the things that you want to avoid when you're shooting portraits outside. I chose to do that one because I wanted to show how I edit to even out the exposure, and it's generally something you want to avoid when you're outside. What you're supposed to do, and what always works, and what I usually adhere to myself, is one of two things. One of them is you backlight them. You sort of do maybe a silhouette, or you have a reflector that's kind of throwing the light back at them, but you have their back to the sun generally. And I do that a lot too, and I'll often use an external light source to light them from the front, and then I use the sun as sort of a hair light. This photo is the other thing you do, and that's stay out of the sunlight and get into the shade. Now, one of the things that made this such a cool photo shoot was that Cassidy chose this place I had no idea existed. I was totally unfamiliar with it, and it's this location sort of just outside of downtown Kansas City called the Kansas City Vine Workhouse, I think. And it's this old building that was built as a jail, but they designed it to look like a castle, and it was built in 1877. I'm going to call up the website here. Kansas City's Vine Street Castle. That's what it looks like from the street when you drive by, and it's basically this abandoned building. It was built to be a jail in the beginning, and then it closed as a jail in about 1924, I think it says, and then it was repurposed many times over the years before it finally became abandoned in 1972, and to this day it just sort of stands there, this really sort of spooky set of ruins that looks really, really cool. So when I saw it, I immediately loved it. But one of the things that you got to be mindful of when you're on a site like this is that it can be dangerous if you're not careful. And in fact, there were some doorways that led to basically no floor. There was a basement, but there's no floor above it. So if you're not careful and you step through the doorway, you're going to fall and hurt yourself, or worse. So be advised that when you go to a place like this, to be careful and be mindful of where you're going, especially for your clients. We knew to be careful. So I settled on this space right here because I really liked how the steps led up to this empty doorway, and behind her there's this depth, this empty room, and I knew I'd be able to take my camera and get some really great separation. I was shooting with a Nikon D750 at the time, and shooting with a Nikon 85mm 1.4. I believe it was the D lens that I owned at the time, and so I got these photos, and so you see that nice pop, where she's in focus and everything behind her is out of focus. And I really loved how that worked out, and that's why I chose this spot, because you see that old building in the background. I mean, it almost looks like you can be sort of in Italy on some ancient Roman ruins, and I dug that a lot. Now, as you may notice that, back there's really not a floor directly behind her. I don't think, maybe 5 feet. It's just a drop off, maybe 10 feet to what was the basement. And so again, always be mindful of your surroundings so that nobody falls and gets hurt or anything like that. But obviously we stayed on the outside of it and we're really careful with that. but you can see just how you could take something and frame it in such a way that it looks like you're in some other place than this Midwestern town, Kansas City. You know, it's like this whole other thing. And I really like that about this, I really like that about this building. Okay, so one of the things you're gonna notice as I scroll through this is that I'm using, as I do in these videos, the Wacom ExpressKey Remote. It's a very, very useful device that I highly recommend to anybody who's doing creative work to increase your productivity. I'll have a link to it in the description below. I'll also have a link to my review of it in the description below. But the photo and what you're looking at is actually the finished version of the photo that we're going to talk about today. So let's go back to the original file. This is the raw file. So basically when you're shooting in the shade, one thing that helps kind of add a little vibrance to it is to go to the calibration panel in Lightroom on the right here at the very bottom. You go to the blue primary, you go to saturation, and you drag it to about +50, and that helps give the photo a little bit more pop, as you can see, and it also gives her skin a little bit more warmth. Ironically, you wouldn't expect that with blue, but that's what it does. And then the next thing I do is I just start messing with the sliders until I get something that I like. And there's a good chance that this version is going to end up looking a bit different than the finished version I just showed you that I edited over 2 years ago. And that's another thing that's pretty common, I guess. You know, each time you go back, it's going to be a little bit different. I tend to do these edits with the idea of making the photo pop a little bit without going too crazy with it. And so I'm just sort of messing around. I have some standard things I just go towards. I mean, you may have observed what I'm doing. Highlights, I always turn the highlights down a little bit. I always bump the shadows up. Sometimes I'll just kind of push the exposure a little bit, and blacks down a little bit, whites. And when I turn up the vibrance, another thing I like to do is turn down the saturation a little bit just to compensate. And then the final thing, usually the final things before I take it into Photoshop, is I go to the HSL and saturation, and I turn down the blue saturation a bit. So as you can see, that's turned all the way down, that's turned all the way up. I usually end up around -25 or so, just a bit. And then you can see that's how it looked when we started, and that's how it looks now. And again, you do this to taste. So, you know, you may be looking at it and thinking, well, it's too much this, or it's too bright, or it's too dark. Or, you know, why don't you just use a preset? Presets don't usually work for me. I've tried them, and sometimes I use them, usually in black and white filters or whatever, but it's just, to me, each photo demands its own unique attention and tweaking until you get it right. And I always feel happier, and I always feel more satisfied with a photo that I've gone through individually and edited. Even if they're from the same series, I mean, sometimes I'll copy and paste a whole set of photos in similar lighting, but I always end up sort of going through and double checking to making sure that they still look good, and I still a lot of times end up tweaking it even further. But anyway, I'm just going to take a good look at this, and I feel like I'm pretty happy with where we're at on this particular photo. So now we're going to take it into Photoshop. On the Wacom tablet here, I have a customized swipe programmed in. All 4 fingers swipe down, and that calls up the Lightroom shortcut grid that I've programmed a bunch of preset keys into, and one of them is open in Photoshop, so you don't have to do the typical right click and scroll down to open in Photoshop. It's a different way of doing it. I mean, it may or may not have seemed any faster to you than what I just did, but that's how I like to do it. And so now it's calling it up, and give it a second, and there we go. First thing I always do is duplicate the layer, and then I just go through and At this stage, what I'm doing is I'm going to go through and remove all the blemishes. Now I'm switching over to the Wacom tablet with the Wacom pen, and it's usually kind of up in the air whether I just really focus on the blemishes first or the flyaway hairs. Usually it's just sort of random, you know, and whatever one just sort of like jumps out at me the most, I'll go to it. But right now I'm just trying to stick to removing the blemishes, and it's pretty straightforward. I'll probably cut through this just so you don't have to watch every single blemish get removed, but I've got the spot healing brush tool selected here. And another method that's also very useful is the patch tool. In that case, you drag you select an area and then you drag it to a clean area, so to speak, and then that'll copy the texture and remove it that way. And I'm given to understand that this is actually better results than the spot healing tool. I use a mix of both, and the spot healing tool tends to be more fun, and this is more involved. But I'm going to switch back to the spot healing tool and continue to edit this. Alright, so even to this point you're already seeing what it looks like. That's before, that's after, and you're already seeing an improvement. And now I'm going to move over and remove the flyaway hairs with the spot healing tool. So one of the things that's really nice about, you know, going into the shade in shooting is that it does tend to give you a nice even ambient light on the subject. I didn't have to use an external flash for this photo, which is always great. I mean, I'll use a softbox and a Flashpoint Evolve 200, I think it's called, the Adorama brand of Godox. I'm again removing flyaway hairs, and quite frequently it's the flyaway hairs, even though I'm still removing blemishes, it's these flyaway hairs like right here that end up taking so much time, and you could really just end up going really down the rabbit hole just getting every single hair just so, because they can be very challenging. But it's just one thing that's just part of editing a portrait, is that you go through and try to get rid of as many as you can, while at the same time, first of all, not driving yourself crazy. That's just part of the territory, right? And doing it in a way that doesn't make the hair and the edges of the hair look fake. So typically at around this stage, I like to take the clone stamp and make sure the mode is set to lighten and that the opacity is around 18 to 20%. And then I go in and I remove any lines or shadows that are underneath the eyes. But in Cassidy's case, she really doesn't have any, so I really don't need to. You might notice just a little bit of change, as this is the before, that's after. If you look closely, you'll see just a subtle change under her eyes. But I'm not really going to do that this time, because in this case, I don't think we need to. So we're not going to worry about that. I'm just going to continue to remove some of these blemishes and come back and change it to the patch tool. And now another thing, you notice I like the leaves on the ground. I'm fine with the leaves, but there's trash on the ground, so I will use the patch tool to remove it. And I mean, I honestly think we're pretty close. This is not going to be a long edit at all. I am just maybe going to get close to calling this a wrap almost. But at this stage, I think in the original edited photo, I cropped her to maybe be more like that. And that's up to you. I mean, I think the photo's fine like that as well. Now, zoomed out, it's hard to tell any difference, but it's when you zoom in that you begin to see the difference in what I've done as far as editing. That's the before, and you can see the flyaway hairs and the blemishes, and that's after. And I could still go in and polish up, and I could, you know, like I said, there's any number of things. You can keep just removing flyaway hairs all day long, but at some point you just have to accept, hey, we got enough flyaway hairs, it's fine. Blemishes, you know, you want to try to get as many blemishes taken care of as you can, obviously, without making the subject look too fake. That's another thing. I usually don't go in and use any kind of blur on the skin, even though that's what a lot of fashion photographers do in order to, you know, make this model's skin look like pristine and perfect. I avoid that. It's not really my thing. I prefer to keep try to keep some sense of naturalness to it. Let's see. And I'm gonna say we're really close. At this stage, what I also like to do is I go to the adjustments and turn up the vibrance. And I know I already did that in Lightroom, but I always like to do it again in Photoshop. And obviously, whenever I turn up the vibrance, I turn down the saturation accordingly. And as you can see, that's where we're at. One final thing I do is I create a new layer, and I go to the marquee tool, turn it into the elliptical marquee tool, set the marquee tool top left corner, drag it to the bottom left corner. So you're going to follow this one closely. Now that I've got that selected, I go to the create new fill or adjustment layer icon at the bottom of the layers palette. Select that, go down to levels. Once the levels are selected, I take the middle one, the mid-tone arrow here, and start moving it to the right. And you're gonna see she's getting darker and darker, but that's not where we're gonna leave it, obviously. So once I've got it to a certain darkness, I mean, and you could adjust it after the fact, go back to layers, and then when you're hovering the mouse over the mask on its layer, double click, and it'll take you into its properties menu. And in the properties menu, click invert, and then take the feather option and move the slider all the way up. And then you have sort of a vignette. That's before, that's after. Before, after. I prefer to use vignettes, especially in portraits, because it helps keep the eye in the middle on the subject. Whereas if you don't have it, doesn't make it a bad photo by any stretch, but it tends to kind of, the eye has a tendency to want to go all over the place. This helps you keep the eye squarely on the subject. And the final thing I'm going to do is, I know photographers use various types of sharpening. I always prefer just to use the unsharpened mask because I always feel like I'm happiest with that result. So that's what I'm going to do, and I just kind of tweak it. And again, I always sort of hover around the 100% amount, and anywhere from 1.5 to maybe 2.0, and then you can see, you know, the difference there. Threshold, yeah, 10% seems fine. I mean, again, these are things that sometimes I change on the spur of the moment. And so I'm going to click OK on that. And I think we're pretty close to having a finished piece. All right, so I think that's about it. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. This is one of my favorite all-time senior portraits. I have a lot of favorites, But hopefully I was able to convey why I like this one in particular. Just the scene and just the environment that I was able to take advantage of, and to get a nice shot where Cassidy sort of pops in the foreground and you have that sort of depth in the background, so that cavernous set of ruins in the background. And like I said, you know, we shot it just outside of downtown Kansas City, but the way I framed it, it does make me think like it's some kind of old Roman ruins and we were sort of in Italy somehow, and we did it, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. And that's a lot of fun, to be able to make something like that happen, and to sort of take something that's, you know, not maybe not that far from you, but frame it and make it look like it's something totally different. And that's really, really cool. And I really appreciate that Cassidy had this place in mind. I really, really was happy with the results, and she was a great subject. And I really want to thank Kylie and Cassidy's parents, Troy and Missy, for hiring me to shoot both their daughters' senior photos. I very much appreciate it. I had a lot of fun, and I love the results that we got. I love the photos we got from both sessions, and so I'm really happy about that. And before I sign off, I just want to ask you one more time to please like and subscribe. It would really help me out as I continue to make these videos and grow this channel. So with that, I want to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.